most disease is really related to lifestyle and environmental factors. And if we can identify all of the factors that create this disruption and harmony or homeostasis, then we can bring order back to the system and the disease largely goes away. So whether you're working with Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, MS, it's very doable.
Welcome to Power to the Patients. I'm your host, Brandon Lee, and today I'm joined by Dr. Ken Sharlin, a neurologist, researcher, and one of the leading voices challenging how we think about neurodegenerative diseases. Welcome to the show, Dr. Sharlin.
Thank you for having me.
Ken, I was thinking maybe a fun place to start here is just, how did you get into this area of research? What kind of sparked your interest here that kind of caught your eye?
Yeah, well, my training as a neurologist, or really, as an MD, started at Emory University and then on to the University of Virginia and Built University, where I finished neurology. So very kind of academically oriented institutions. So really from the very beginning, I was steeped in research. And then upon finishing my residency, I joined a practice in Nashville that was also very research-oriented, primarily focusing on headache. And so I've really been in that research arena for a long time, which for me has not just been about helping to develop new treatments, but in effect, when various investigational products are developed, it really gives me an opportunity to dig into the mechanisms of disease and really understanding why people get sick. And so I think that was really a big part of it. And then subsequently, I got interested in functional and regenerative medicine and was able to really bring all the puzzle pieces together.
How do you think about balancing research and practice in your day-to-day?
Well, it takes a lot of help, right? I do head of operations, and I have a team in the research division that really handles a lot of the day-to-day activities. Because clinical trials are blinded and we do everything we can besides blinding to not introduce bias, much of the role of the principal investigator is oversight, is safety. So a lot of the sort of day-to-day, moment-to-moment, engaging with subjects, things like that are actually handled by others, because the more I sort of am injected into that mix, there's, obviously a greater risk of bias and things like that. So that part does make it a little easier.
You're well known for talking about this idea of disease reversal in conditions where it hasn't historically been feasible. I'm kind of curious, can you share some patient story or clinical moment that shaped how you think about the possibility for reversal?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think the pivot point is that as you go through very traditional Western medical education. And it hasn't, by the way, I should back up and say, we think of ourselves, and I'm going to use a term that doesn't exactly apply to this sort of ethnocentric way, meaning, how things happen when you go to the doctors, the way it's supposed to be and the way it's been until, well, at least once modern medicine was discovered. And, my point is that the healing arts have been around for thousands upon thousands of years. And there are many traditions, many philosophies, many approaches that overlap or really are in another camp altogether from the traditional disease-centered model that we practice. It says, you have MS, therefore you get this drug. You have Alzheimer's disease, therefore you get this drug. Ayurvedic medicine, a lot of Chinese medicine really come from, different traditions that actually lend themselves very well to root cause medicine. For example, the very common philosophy that illness starts in the gut, and you heal the gut and if you heal the gut, you're coming a long way to healing the patient. And that's sort of a cliche in functional medicine, but there is a lot of truth to that. As we unpack things like Parkinson's, for example, and the pathological protein that is associated, it's a hallmark of Parkinson's disease. And, what we find when we look at the Lewy body under more of an electron microscope, we see these the accumulation is alpha-synuclein proteins. There's some thought that the disease actually begins in the digestive tract and makes its way to the brain. So in other words, there's a lot of tradition here, but the science and the tradition and the culture are all intersecting, and things that were passed along more or less without the science have now been validated by the science. So functional medicine really focuses on what's called systems biology, which is a different way of thinking about how we work as human beings, because we're so used to seeing whatever specialist is important for whatever disease you need. For example, if you have Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, you see a neurologist, a brain expert. If you have a digestive system issue, you see a gastroenterologist. But the reality is, while we certainly have various organs in our body, these organs don't operate separate from other organs in the body. We're really one total human being. And so when we shift balance in an organ system, it too often creates problems in other areas, which can, among other things, lead to polypharmacy and a lot of disease management rather than disease reversal, as you're talking about. When we start to understand really organizational systems in the language of functional medicine, they use words like assimilation, which refers to the digestive tract, everything from how we take food in. We start to chew on that food and break it down in the mouth and then mix salivary enzymes. We have to swallow it, get it down to the stomach where it's then broken down more enzymes, hydrochloric acid, and then its journey through the digestive tract, ultimately to be able to take in the nutrients through the digestive tract that travel through the bloodstream, go to our cells, and really drive a lot of the cellular reactions that make us human. There are other systems like energy systems, communication systems. These would be things like neurotransmitters and other signaling molecules, hormones, systems that are involved in detoxification, or immune systems called defense and repair in functional medicine. And the reality is, though, that all of these systems actually operate in harmony. The term we would use is homeostasis. And then when there's a disruption of homeostasis, which probably occurs all the time, then at the tissue or cellular level, there has to be an adaptive response to that. Now, in some cases, if that disruption, if that stress response, as I'll call it, is short lived, we as human beings or tissues or cells can return back to functioning, the way they had been just before that stress or that disruption was introduced. But if the disruption is persistent and long term, there has to be an adaptive response that attempts to return some degree of balance to the system, but it may not actually ultimately serve us as total human beings. So, in other words, what ends up happening is that disease, as we see it, it's an inconvenience. It obviously can be a fatal problem or certainly lead to long-term morbidity, disability and so forth. Really, these are all maladaptive or adaptive responses of the body that don't necessarily serve us as human beings. I want my life back. I want to be the way I was. When you start to understand the things that disrupt these systems, tissues, cells, so forth, subcellular structures like mitochondria, then you can start to do things to restore that balance. And in the end, instead of treating a disease, you're creating harmony or homeostasis. And we as organisms, oh my gosh, the disease is gone, but I didn't actually treat the disease. I, help that person restore that balance and the disease kind of goes away. So that's kind of the overriding philosophy of it. There's obviously a lot more to it. But in the end, what I think the listeners or viewers should understand, because this is not obviously a functional medicine podcast, I'm going to say some things that are kind of cliches. We say it all the time. We say, well, genes may load the gun. It's lifestyle and environment that really pulls the trigger. In other words, most disease is really related to lifestyle and environmental factors. And if we can identify all of the factors that create this disruption and harmony or homeostasis, then we can bring order back to the system and the disease largely goes away. So whether you're working with Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, MS, it's very doable.
What do you see as being, I guess, the kind of most exciting frontier across these three disease states? What are you seeing out there as truly innovative or interesting right now?
Well, picking up on the last question, where sir, what's happened now is that I think we're moving away from the traditional functional medicine framework. Conventional medicine is moving away from its disease model, its disease-centered framework, and things are starting to integrate. And instead, I happened to be in Salt Lake City about a week ago and gave a talk to an audience that is familiar with functional medicine. And I said, I learned my foundations of functional medicine back in about 2013. But what's happened since then, and to your question, is that we've really have the emergence of precision medicine, of systems biology, not just the way that it was framed when I learned functional medicine, but systems biology from a very 2025 perspective, where now we can really break down the reasons why this disruption of homeostasis has occurred. And with things like biological markers, which I'm very passionate about, we can do an even better job of providing this personalized precision medicine. And then the reality is that because this is personalized, because everyone is unique, we can use the tools of conventional medicine, the emerging treatments that come out of research, the treatments that are maybe still in research, but really are maybe in the realm of regenerative medicine, where anti-aging as a principle, or understanding the biology of aging, is now coming into the clinic. And there are anti-aging specialists. No one really actually dies of old age. You can't put old age on a death certificate. You have to put a disease. So to be an aging specialist, you still have to understand Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and so forth. And then we can bring, some of the principles of functional medicine in there. And I think when those come together, when we're really masters at behavior, because that's really a lot of what functional medicine is about, because you can't tell someone, hey, change your diet and exercise, and expect that they're going to go home and do that. But in fact, food and movement are very powerful medicine. We begin to embrace that in the clinic, and then utilize a drug where needed, and then utilize a regenerative medicine principle, whether that happens to be, photobiomodulation or senolytic therapy, which is coming of age. Then we have a really powerful cocktail for helping people restore their vitality.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, there's a holistic approach here that you're advocating for, between food, movement, potentially a therapeutic intervention, and a regenerative kind of process. How do you think about the kind of journey that you need to take patients through, and kind of maybe hitting all these key points?
So I would circle back around to this, first of all, this idea that, everyone is unique, not just biochemically and genetically otherwise, but in our belief systems, our perspective on the world, our mood, our philosophy, our sort of spiritual selves, which too often, not always, but too often conventional medicine ignores, because there's such a heavy focus on what drug do you get or what surgical procedure do you get, depending on your diagnosis or where you are in the natural history of that diagnosis, like Parkinson's disease. Once we start to embrace that whole person, then things really change. So at the core of functional medicine, I said, it is really behavioral change. And behavioral change comes sort of from within. It's something we passionately want to do. It's a felt behavior, if you will. We don't do things often, or at least sustain them, because intellectually we think it's the right thing to do. I mean, hopefully no one in their right mind intellectually decides to smoke cigarettes. People understand that it's not good for them, and yet there's still plenty of smokers out there, even though we're seeing quite a encouraging drop in the prevalence of cigarette smoking. There are several psychological models of change. The one that I'm most familiar with is called the trans-theoretical model of Prochaska. And really it takes a person from this concept of what we call pre-contemplation, meaning I didn't even realize it was a thing, right? So I didn't know about it, because I expected to go to the doctor, see him or her for 5 minutes, get a prescription, and then they say, see you in 6 months, right? Then there's some degree of familiarity, right? So they're, yeah, I heard of that, right? We call that, like contemplation. Then there's simple action steps, like I went to the running store, I bought the gear, I got the shoes, I signed up for the 5K, whatever. But I have to get my plan. I have to actually do, some training, right? So then the next step is action. Now you're actually doing it, right? And of course, we all kind of fall off the wagon, and there's a component of if you fall off, how do you get back on and maintain that? But in the long run, what we have to do is capture people at a moment, at least at that contemplation or possibly preparation, or in some cases in an action step, but maybe not the action step that is really best for them to get the outcome they want. But if you have someone for whom it's not even in their circle of awareness, you could talk to them all day about how good kale is for your brain, and they're going to be like, I hate kale. I'm not doing that. So functional medicine is wonderful, but it's really a partnership as opposed to traditional medicine and even regenerative medicine, where we're used to having people do things to us or for us, or here, take this pill or take this shot or do this surgery. That's a more passive engagement.
You've chosen to be both a clinician and a principal investigator. So clearly there's a kind of like part in, there's a need you're seeing, I guess, in the, through the lens of clinical trials or through the lens of kind of development. Let's use MS for like as an example. What is the gap that you're really seeing here that that needs more investigation?
For the most part, and to be clear, I would say among all the areas in neurology, MS by far has, really made the most advances. Right? Neurologists used to own, if you will, the expression of diagnose and adios, because we're a great diagnostician, but we didn't have the tools in their toolbox, at least as far as drugs. And in 1993, when beta seron came out for MS, at least in the United States, worldwide, I'm sure, was under such demand as the first disease modifying therapy, there was actually a lottery to be able to obtain beta seron. And many people using beta seron anymore because we have a lot more effective drugs than beta seron. However, for the most part, when you look at all the varied mechanisms of action, the newest, things that we're playing around with, the Bruton tyrosine kinase inhibitors to, CD20 and CD40 B cell depletion therapies and other mechanisms of action. The reality is that all of these really are, for the most part, focusing on the inflammatory component that is MS. And so I think what's going to be really exciting in these next generations of treatment, really, hopefully, first of all, we'll get further upstream in terms of root causes, but also be able to help the person dealing with maybe a non-inflammatory progressive MS where they're seeing a much more degenerative pattern. They're losing neurons, there's programmed cell death, and be able to turn off that process, and then maybe even help put the brain more into repair mode as opposed to sort of be the bucket of water on the fire of inflammation.
Let's double click there a little bit. When you say going a little bit more upstream, what are the kind of effects that you're hoping to be able to see? Let's call it like 5 years from now.
First of all, I think we're going to do a better and better job of being able to understand what are the unique characteristics of this person's MS. We still have this very large toolbox, I think probably 27, 28 different disease modifying therapies. But in the end, there are ways to determine if the treatment is working, but before you initiate treatment, how do you ultimately say, oh, well, you're a good candidate. The best thing for you is going to be, B cell depletion therapy, but you need to be on a BTK inhibitor and you need to be on a T cell sequestration drug, one of the, like a Gilenya kind of drug, Mazent and Ponvory and so forth. Maybe there are people who need to be on a teriflunomide or even an interferon beta 1A or beta 1B, but we tend to look at it like high efficacy, low efficacy. How old are you? Maybe what is your gender, if that makes a difference, of childbearing potential, things that of course are relevant, but ultimately don't inform us as much about that person's MS as maybe demographic characteristics and things like that. On the other hand, if you look at a company like Octave Bioscience, which is in the sort of diagnostic, well, not really diagnostic, but I would say prognostic area of medicine, meaning that they have this test called the MS disease activity test. And they look at 18 different biological markers that are relevant to MS, and they're divided into 4 different categories. You have neuroinflammation and immune modulation and myelin biology, and then what they call neuroaxonal integrity. And then you get a score. There's a proprietary algorithm that's a weighted average, if you will, of these different individual markers scored from 1 to 10, where 1 to 4 is low disease activity, 4.5 to 7 is moderate disease activity, and then 7.5 to 10 is high disease activity. And what the test tells us is that if you're in the high disease activity category compared to low to moderate, you're 23 times more likely to have a new lesion on MRI in the next 6 months, allowing us to be predictive of response to therapy and take action proactively if we think someone needs to do something different. But in the ideal perfect world, we should be able to take those individual biological markers and really characterize Brandon's MS or Ken's MS, and then say, based on this unique blueprint, here's the treatment that predictively is going to maybe even put you in remission or reverse your MS, right? I mean, I think we will get there, but we have to be able to look at all aspects of the disease, not just the inflammatory component.
What do you think is really missing in our ability to be more predictive or kind of pursue this vision of like a really like precise recommendation for an individual?
I think it's a mix of things. I think, for example, I don't know how many of the physicians who are watching this podcast will have even heard of that test. So, in order to promote these new cutting edge technologies, in order for the companies to invest, the venture capital firms, the grants, the government saying, we'll give you $10 million to do this, we have to create a demand, right? So we have to be using these things in our everyday practice. In the world of MS, we've just adopted the 2024 Donald criteria, an update for the 2017 criteria. And it's not even called 2025, right? But we're 2026 for that matter. So we adopted, and we're already 2 years behind. It's interesting to me that while there's sort of quasi biological markers like oligoclonal bands or the presence of central vein signs, we haven't said anything about neurofilament light chain and gliofibrillary acidic protein. So we have to create the demand. We have to adopt the technology. We have to make the investments. And then I think, the science will evolve much more quickly. And then, of course, we have that element that in a world where we expect a third-party payer to engage in the cost of medicine, we have to have those third-party payers agreeing to cover at least a portion of the cost of all of this. It is a variety of things. It said that, the average practicing physician, it may be 10 years behind what the most cutting edge emerging technologies and knowledge base, are. But on the other hand, we've got to move that along because we really are in, 2025, almost 2026. And there are some really, truly remarkable things either have just happened in the last couple of years, or, we're going to see them come next year. For example, similar blood tests for Parkinson's disease, where we can actually look at blood-based biomarkers, and ultimately that'll come hand in hand with some of the up-and-coming disease-modifying therapies for that disease.
Yeah, certainly. So I love this topic of better diagnostics, and certainly better diagnostics have shown up as a theme on this podcast. What are some of the other like innovative domains that you're really excited to see play out?
Well, I would say better diagnostics, but also better prognostics, right? And better predictors, because we've been pretty good at the diagnostic piece generally, although arguably, for example, in Alzheimer's, there was a paper that came out in JAMA that basically looked at how good are we at the clinical diagnosis of Alzheimer's. The answer is not very good. It was about 60% in the primary care group and about 70% accurate among specialists. But now we can do, whether it's an amyloid PET scan, spinal fluid testing for amyloid and tau, total tau, phosphorylated tau, where now we can use through the LumiPulse technology tools like what Precivity's or the C2N Diagnostics has developed, the Precivity's AD2 test, which is a highly, highly accurate blood-based biological marker. But again, these are diagnostic, although I do use the Precivity's test as a predictor or tracker of disease activity. And I think that's a really, really important tool in the toolbox that we're not used to. We're used to maybe best in the clinic where we're not doing, and I'm now talking about MS, an extended disability status scale because it's very cumbersome. It takes too long. We at least do a 25-foot walk, a peg hold test, things like that. We get some objective markers of what's going on clinically, but that doesn't necessarily predict what's going on at the cellular, at the subcellular level, what's going on. We know that people could have new lesions and just feel fine, right, with MS. And so the more that we can incorporate these predictive markers, these tracking markers, that I think it's really going to be the game changer for a lot of folks. And then start to realize that the drugs they are a gift. These are companies willing to invest, literally billions of dollars to develop incredible treatments, but they're not the only thing out there. And we need to be able to embrace some of these technologies that have been validated. And I am particularly interested in the role of various forms of energy, meaning how can electricity heal the brain? How can electromagnetic fields heal the brain? How can light or sound? And it's out there, whether it's photobiomodulation, whether it's transcranial direct current stimulation, whether it's TMS that has been approved, in psychiatry, whether it's how sound waves impact at the cellular level even. There's fascinating research on applying sound and changing the behavior of cells. We can do it very holistically with binaural rhythms and things like that. But there's some really elegant experiments using sound waves as healing modalities. And it sounds kind of crazy and sci-fi, but it's out there and it could be incorporated into a more integrative approach.
Fascinating. I've been following a lot of this in the world of psychiatry, but I haven't been following it as closely in the world of neurology. Can you tell me a little bit more about the applications of sound and waves as a healing modality here?
Yeah, I mean, in general, pretty much any form of energy has biological therapeutic application. I've been interested in transcranial direct current stimulation for a long time. That technology has been around 25 years. I mean, there are large conferences where biomedical engineers and clinical researchers all gather and present their data. But how often does that show up in a neurology clinic? And yet there's application for cognitive decline. There's application for mood enhancement. It's been studied in helping to restore language after stroke, for example, or improve motor function. So that's just one example. Direct current stimulation. You can use alternating current stimulation, which follows more of the principles of brain entrainment, where we know that certain brainwave frequencies are associated with certain states of awareness, from being highly focused to sort of calm and meditative to being sleepy or even being in a coma. And using alternating current stimulation or certain engineered sound waves, you can actually drive the brain into those states. Consumer health is actually far ahead in terms of reaching people with these technologies than the medical field, right? There are few devices that are actually FDA approved and being used on an everyday basis, like TMS. There are some devices in the area of migraine, gamma core. There's a little personal transcranial magnetic stimulator for migraine. There's a green light device. There's a peripheral nerve stimulator called the Neurivio device. But by and large, many of these devices sit on the shelves, waiting for clinicians to adapt or adopt. But on the other hand, many of them are available without a prescription because they're being promoted as health devices. And Apple, Google, they're very invested in these things. I mean, the first Apple Watch asked us to stop once an hour and breathe for a minute, right? That mandala that would kind of go like this if you had an Apple Watch. Well, there's tremendous amount of science behind why these slow in and out breaths actually put the body into that parasympathetic healing mode. And it can be a very supportive adjunct modality to the treatment of illness.
Ken, I'd like to maybe focus the rest of our time here a little bit on the kind of like lessons learned running clinical trials, like in this space. I'm curious, as an investigator, what is the thing that you wish sponsors knew most about designing their trials to work best with you and sites?
I have a tremendous amount of respect for the sponsors and the complexity of orchestrating clinical trials because it's, the sponsor in the end, it's sort of like the old Harry S. Truman expression, the buck stops here. But the reality is they have to then contract with power. They have to contract CRO and all these other, vendors to make this thing happen. And I can't even begin to imagine how many hours sort of blood, sweat, and tears goes into putting all of that together and then being able to press the button and say, go, we're ready to start. Being on the end of being just, a PI at a site where there are thousands of sites, of course, around the world, I also know that when I'm approached by a sponsor, say, hey, we're developing this trial, we've got this investigational new drug, we're very interested in your site and what you can bring to the table to help us ultimately get as many subjects into the trial and get this trial done, because time is always of the essence in clinical trials. But even before, that trial, we get the go light, we get the green light. Okay, we get site initiation and you're ready to go. I mean, it's not uncommon to be approached by a sponsor, and that trial doesn't even start till another year later. So I think, and then I have found myself, and I've learned this lesson in the hard way, telling some of my patients, hey, you might be a really great candidate for a study that we're going to be doing soon. And then it doesn't even happen for another year. And it kind of creates a little bit of frustration. And maybe they go on to do something else, patient or subject. So I think how trials are ultimately planned and then executed, the more tools we have to sort of bring that up to speed. Again, I don't mean this in any critical way because I can't even imagine how the complexities of how this is all put together. But surely with everything that happens with, AI and the way we can now communicate with one another, we're not on paper anymore, right? That this timeline can be compressed both in preparation for initiating the trial and then ultimately in executing the trial, in analyzing the data, and getting it in front of the FDA if that treatment looks promising.
It sounds, if I'm reading between the lines, it sounds like maybe a little bit of frustration in the timing, the telegraphed timing of something that could be down the road, could be coming down the road, but then you might have gotten a patient's hopes up, and that's frustrating for everybody involved.
But I'm sure sponsors and CROs CROs are there to serve the sponsor in the way and the sites, but we're ready when you're ready kind of thing. But I'm sure there's not necessarily frustration, but I'm sure there's desire to streamline that process and make it as smooth as possible all the time. How can we do it better? How can we do it better? I would say in the area of MS specifically, it must be especially challenging for sponsors who develop new treatments or potential new treatments because we have so many treatments already for multiple sclerosis that, in my clinic, my patients do extremely well. And so, when the sponsor comes to me and says, well, how many patients can you recruit for this trial? It becomes increasingly challenging because our patients do well, because there are so many treatments already out there. So I think, when we start to explore truly novel mechanisms, one study that we're going to be launching is based on mRNA technology and targeting Epstein-Barr virus. And one subset of individuals who are potentially eligible for the study don't even have clinical MS yet. They may just have what we call radiologically isolated syndrome, where somebody gets an MRI for some unrelated reason, and the radiologist says, what's going on with this person? They look like they have MS. They have MS. They're like, no, they don't have a diagnosis. Radiologically isolated syndrome. Treat them with this mRNA vaccine, if you will, targeting Epstein-Barr virus and so forth. They never get MS. To me, that I wanted to be part of that trial so badly because that's so different, right? And so to me, to think of ways in which we can really prevent this very disabling disease.
Ken, I've so enjoyed this conversation. I want to maybe end on a future looking note here. If you look maybe 10 years into the future, what do you envision to change most about clinical care in MS?
I would say the theme of our podcast today has really spoken a lot to that. I think the injection of precision medicine principles, whether that's diagnostic, whether it's predictive, whether it's prognostic, whether it is precision medicine and AI that allows companies like the Lillys, the Sanofis, the Serranos, the Biogens, et cetera, to develop treatments that we could never have even considered developing, or it would have taken, 20 years to develop. It took at least 15 years or at least 10 to bring CGRP inhibitors for migraine to market, from the realization that migraine sufferers are sensitive to calcitonin gene-related peptide to developing an actual treatment, a biologic or a traditional pharmacological therapy that blocks CGRP. So I think that's going to be really exciting. This precision medicine, the infusion of AI in drug development and study design and analysis, emerging technologies that allow us to get a much more precise handle on what's going on the individual level. And then I think remote physiologic and therapeutic monitoring, so that subjects will be coming into this research site less often, but we are collecting continuous data from devices that are attached in some way to the patient, much like an Apple Watch.
Well, that's an exciting vision for the future. Ken, is there anything that we didn't talk about yet today that you'd like to end on?
Well, I would just say that I encourage your viewers and listeners to explore, to really open their mind to the idea that healing comes from many places. And these drugs and treatments that we traditionally depend on are important, but they can be incorporated into a bigger toolbox. And that we as human beings, we're all patients. I'm a patient, you're a patient sometimes. We should be left with a feeling of empowerment and hope, and know that in the end, we should be in a partnership with our doctors, because we have to own some of this stuff and know that if we apply, say, the principles of lifestyle medicine, even when we still take the drug will work much, much, much better, and ultimately we'll get the outcome that we want. So just be very open and know that there's a lot out there. Sometimes we're not told about it, but go to Barnes and Noble or, Amazon. The books are out there. I was inspired by people like David Perlmutter and Terry Walls, and I worked with Dr. Dale Bredesen when he first started talking about Alzheimer's reversal. And he and I we still occasionally communicate and certainly respect him, but we're not working together per se now. That I have my own patients where I've been able to document objectively that when they started with me, they had the neuropathological changes of Alzheimer's disease, but now they no longer have those neuropathological changes.
Well, Ken, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation, teach me about your methodology, the kind of holistic approach that you're bringing to the space. It's certainly exciting to kind of hear from folks who are like really leading the charge here.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.